it's my pleasure to introduce to you Altay. I think that most of you already know him, but let me introduce him for the persons who do not know him. So he has origins in the German academic system. He was for a very long time at the University of Trier, made his PhD on the Gens Ausonia there, and worked in a habilitations on a second book project on Galatians. And since then, he has published so many articles, so many books, so over, I think, 300 publications. And these publications are on several topics. So he worked mainly on Hellenistic dynasties, on the Seleucids, on Judea, on the Black Sea, and also Asia Minor. So he has many perspectives on different dynasties in the Hellenistic times. And he worked also a lot on the mythogeography of the archaeological landscape and on these colonial foundation stories. And he's very productive besides this academic publishing. He's also working on the so-called unheard voices of the past together with Ben Skolnick. And he had also stimulated a new student genre, if I understand it right, the epic threads. So an opportunity for students to publish their own work here at the University of Waterloo. And we are very excited, I think, to hear your presentation about Gyptis, Petta, or Aristoxene, and Aristarche of Massalia. Or closer look to the foundation stories of Massalia. Thank you, Jean.
I do have a handout for the people in the room. I wonder, have I shared with you my handout file as well? Then you could share it through the chat box. But could you display, share and display at the same time?
I don't think I could send like a you sent it to me as a PDF.
Yeah, but if I don't, I will send it afterwards. Then I apologize. But we would now start with my PowerPoint. So all the text I'm going to use, they are on the slides, and I just printed out the three main texts once again on the handout, and immediately after the lecture, I will then share that. Sorry, my computer is now not running. And so we are, the title is Gyptis, Petta, Aristoxene, and Aristarche of Massalia. And this paper today stands in a wider context. I have to give it one more click so that I can use the remote. And here it's coming up. So first I'd like to say a little bit about the research context. Then I will introduce Petta, Aristoxene, in the tradition of Aristotle. I will talk a bit about Gyptis in the tradition of Justin, who is the same individual in the ever-evolving narrative. I will then highlight some side figures in the foundation narrative of Massalia, Protis, and the goddess Artemis. And that will be on the basis of coin evidence. Then I'll try to draw some conclusions and illustrate what I mean with the reconstruction of dynamic accounts of foundation stories by looking at Massalia and how the story evolved over time. I hope I have some time left to give an outlook of the afterlife in the modern age of this story. So the wider context may be described by referring to a double panel that I co-organized at the FIEC conference in Wrocław this summer, colonial encounters, reconceptualizations from the archaic period to postmodernism. So the focus should be here on reconceptualizations. Stories and ethnic relations are conceptualized. I think we all understand that, and we understand that narratives often encapsulate such concepts as visual sources may do. But the focus of my own research and of many of those who join me in this network is to look at how original context or early concepts are constantly changed with changing frameworks, changing ideological, political, demographic frameworks. And we want to take this investigation through not only from the archaic period to, say, late antiquity, but there is also a long afterlife taking us well into the postmodern and also post-colonial age. My personal focus is particularly on legends, on these narratives that encapsulate ethnic identity in stories, and very often we only have fragments of these stories, and we have to reconstruct them in very painstaking ways, following the tradition of classical philology. But I think we can do better when we have a clearer understanding how there was a constant correlation between an ideologically changing framework on the one hand, and a slightly changing narrative, where these minor changes, name changes, genealogical changes, are actually often the result of a new reconstruction of ethnic or interethnic relations. So what I hope to achieve is to work towards a typology of narrative elements and narrative patterns. And Stone's paper at the end of this morning was already a stunning attempt at taking us as much further on this way. What I'd also like to pursue is kind of a world history, of course, with a focus on the Mediterranean world, to identify major ideological trends, but then show how these major trends also correlate to major narrative patterns and changes of previous narrative patterns. So I hope to illustrate that today, as we have a focus on female roles, by concentrating on the role of Gyptis, Petta, Aristoxene, and then adding also a little bit of on Aristarche on this. Here I have an illustration for which I found the date 1789. In Stone's presentation, it was 1772. He may well be right. I've only very recently turned to studying these later representations of the legend. What we do see in this late 18th century presentation, in the context of a growing national self-construction of the French, a very oops, what did I do? That was the wrong button. So a very self-confident female figure in the laser does not work on the screen, in the center. So she is standing in between her father, the proud, strong Celtic leader Nannos, and who is receiving and sitting in front of the Greek newcomer, who has various names, Euxenos or Simos in various traditions. And it's interesting that they are actually on par. They are at the same level. But it's clear that the Celtic king and his daughter are the ones that receive. They do not just randomly let in, but they actually invite in, I would say, Hellenic Greek refinement to nobilitate further Gaulish strength. And the strength is not just represented in the muscles, but also in the long hair of him and also of his daughter, both in the Gaulish and in the Germanic traditions. Hair is also a symbol for strength. So let's now move on and look at our ancient sources. What does Aristotle tell us? Or why do I start with Aristotle when the foundation is assumed to have happened around 600 BCE? We do not have any noteworthy sources prior to Aristotle in the 4th century. Even though we know that Hecataeus wrote about Massalia, that's mentioned by Stephanus of Byzantium, so a millennium later. Herodotus, surprisingly, in the 5th century, does not mention Massalia at all, although he mentions Phocaean refugees. And Massalia, I should have mentioned that before, is a foundation of the Phocaeans from Western Asia Minor. And so it's quite surprising that they are not mentioned, that there are tiny fragments of contemporaries, younger contemporaries of Herodotus, by Antiochus of Syracuse and by Thucydides, but very minor references. So for the first narrative, we have to wait until Aristotle. And here I give you the full paragraph that Aristotle has, not more. And in fact, we don't have it directly from Aristotle, but we have it in a version of Athenaeus in the 2nd century CE from his De No Sophistae. So in his treatise or discussions of symposiastic culture, and so it's one of the many episodes. Aristotle also, in his Constitution of the Massaliotes, mentions a similar circumstance as having taken place, writing as follows: the Phocaeans in Ionia, having consulted the oracle, founded Massalia, and Euxenos, the Phocaean, was connected by ties of hospitality with Nannos. This was the name of the king of the country. This Nannos was celebrating the marriage feast of his daughter and invited Euxenos, who happened to be in the neighborhood, to the feast. And the marriage was to be conducted in the following manner. After the supper was over, the girl was to come in and to give a goblet full of wine properly mixed to whichever of the suitors who were present she chose. And to whomsoever she gave it, he was to be her bridegroom. And when the girl came in, whether it was by chance or whether it was for any other reason, she gave the goblet to Euxenos. And the name of that maiden was Petta. And when the cup had been given in this way, and her father, thinking that she had been directed by the deity in her giving of it, had consented that Euxenos should have her, he took her for his wife and cohabited with her, changing her name to Aristoxene. And the family which is descended from that girl remains in Massalia to this day and is known as the Protiadai. For Protis was the name of the son of Euxenos and Aristoxene. And I know it is difficult to take in all this information, but when we have to deal with legends, very often legends are spun around genealogy. So putting the main names into a genealogical tree helps us to summarize and keep track of the main facts. Nannos was the king of the Celto-Ligurian tribes of the Segobrigian, oh goodness, let's say of this southern Gaulish tribe. The name will come later to me again. In this account, the name of the daughter was Petta, later renamed into Aristoxene, and the name of the Greek from Phocaea was Euxenos, the name of their son Protis, and the offspring of that marriage, or rather of the son, were called the Protiadai. When we look more closely at this very short text, we can immediately see that there are various sources conflated to each other. We can at least identify an older and a younger layer. What I think we can see is an older layer which was typically concerned with friendship and alliance and intermarriage. So as a legitimation of the settlement. But then there's a proteadic layer, which may be early, but it's not easy to say how early, how late it was, but a layer that seemed to be justifying the leadership of a certain group, which claimed descent from Protis, and through Protis from Euxenos, Petta, and Nannos. I have suggested that they were actually part of the original Aeolian settlers from Phocaea that claimed supremacy over later settlers. It's very common in Greek colonies that there were very different periods of influx settlers then from different Greek areas. So we have traces of settlements coming from Ephesus and Ionia, perhaps around 500 BCE, and it seems that the Protiadai were claiming leadership over them. I have come up with another observation, and I'm happy to discuss it later on. Petta has no meaning in Greek or Latin, but it may have a meaning in Gaulish. It may be etymologized as the demander. That is actually the role of that girl. She is demanding. And why do I think it makes sense to try to understand her name through the etymology? Well, also Euxenos and Aristoxene are speaking names. The good foreigner or the good guest, Euxenos, and Aristoxene, the best host. That's the literal translations, or I have this on this slide. However, with these names, and especially with the new name, Petta, changed to Aristoxene, we seem to have a later layer. It seems that at some point, descent from Celto-Ligurians was no longer fashionable for the Greeks, so they Hellenized Petta. She was given a Greek name. And in fact, her Hellenization is also symbolized by the fact that she offered well-mixed wine. That is something that Gauls were not known for. They would either not know wine at all, or they would be drunk all the time, at least in the representation of the Greeks and the Romans. So she is now represented as one who was Greek from the very beginning, to make it more tolerable that the Protiadai, or perhaps, the Massaliotes, were descendants of her. Our second main source is from Justin, and he's drawing on Pompeius Trogus's account. Interestingly, Pompeius Trogus explicitly refers to his grandfather who lived in the time of Pompey, say he may have written around the 70s BCE, whereas Trogus was a contemporary of Augustus, and Justin's work is very difficult to date. I tend to date it into the 2nd century CE, but dates vary by centuries. Now, we understand it's very late, very remote from the origin. It's quite lengthy, much more detailed than Aristotle, and I can't read the whole thing. What we do see is that in Roman times, there's a heavy Roman imperial frame. The Phocaeans are now represented as not going to Massalia first, but stopping by in Rome, saying hi to King Tarquinius, and making an alliance with him and receiving permission from him for their settlements amongst the savage Gaulish tribes. So that is clearly a Roman frame. But here's the story once again retold. And I will not read it out because we would then run against the time. So rather, I give my summary version here. We also have Nannos as the king, who has a daughter to be given into marriage. But here her name is Gyptis, very different name. And here we have two leaders of the Greek settlers. One is Simos and one is Protis. Oh, Protis has moved up in the genealogy. That's quite remarkable. What may be the meaning of these changes? We may get a hint when we read more closely in Justin and understand that he makes it explicitly. The Massaliotes are the descendants of the Greeks. No mixed descent. So they are generally attributed to the Greeks, and then one would think of Simos rather than Protis, but if Protis, then certainly not from Gyptis. That's quite explicit. So the Athenian turn, which I mentioned this morning a couple of times, the anti-barbarian stance of Greeks that could no longer tolerate a self-description that involved non-Greek elements, is clearly tangible here. But further, I think we are even a little later, we are at a time when the Protiadai no longer played a role. So I do think in these two different texts, or from these two different texts compared, we can learn that once there was a time when as an elite group amongst the Massaliotes claimed their leadership through descent from both the original Greek settlers and the local king and his daughter, and that was changed in a later time. And we also see a shift in the claim to the land. Yes, there was this marriage, but there was more. There is a stronger moralizing frame that the Greeks are better, and that ultimately in the longer narrative, the Celto-Ligurians become traitors, so they had to be punished and they were conquered and expelled. So we have a very strong shift in the explanation or in the legitimation strategy. But then I do think that we have very old elements in this very young narrative. The name Simos, the name Gyptis, they seem to be older than the names we have encountered in Aristotle, because they are Simos is just a normal Greek name with no specific meaning that is adapted or lucid in the narrative. He may have been, or the leader of the Phocaeans might have been a Simos. And then there is Gyptis. There have been some attempts at etymologizing it. It may be referring to the vulture, say a bird of prey. That may be an onomastic motif here, but it's not connected to a theme in the narrative. And I think that lets these two names appear older, go before the speaking names Euxenos, Petta, and Aristoxene. So the difficulty that we have is we have late narratives, and these already conflate a variety of text layers or narrative layers. Let's move on and look at the numismatic evidence, where I think we find a very valuable complementation of our evidence. I will not speak about the earliest archaic coins from the last quarter of the 6th century, very difficult to interpret, but as of around 475, we have a dominant motif. We have an unnamed man, probably military leader, as we can see from the helmet. And then on the reverse, but even on the helmet itself, we see a symbol of a wheel, a four-spoke wheel. And the wheel is actually a symbol often affiliated with the Gauls. They had a horse riding culture, but also a charioteer culture. And what I think we see here is that the tradition of protis became established, or at least leadership was established or reclaimed around 475. Leadership that would claim descent from the Greek settlers and from the local princes. So that is what I see reflected here, and we see these ongoing in some variation. And only as of the 4th century we see that Apollo becomes the dominant deity, and Apollo is perhaps best related to Miletus and Didyma as one of the representative deities for Ionian colonization. But Apollo does not stay for always in the lead. In the 3rd century, it's Artemis who takes over. Here, one illustration, and on the reverse, a lion, and the letters starting the name of Massalia or Massalioton. And the lion reminds us of the old Anatolian, then Lydian and Ionian tradition. So this still seems to connect us with Western Asia Minor, the archaic period, but also probably with the Ephesian Artemis. And here another version of it. It is Strabo to help us, who helps us to shed light on this tradition that we'll find later on the coins. He does not, in his geography, give us an account of the foundation of Artemis, but he just mentions in passing that there was a leading sanctuary of Artemis Ephesia in Massalia, and then he tells us a story about the priestess Aristarche, who hailed from Ephesus, and she's said to have joined the first settlers around 600. And then she also mentions that there was another sanctuary in a secondary role, namely that of Apollo Delphinios. And he claims that it was typical of the Ionian League, which it was not necessarily. But that is interesting. How can we actually make sense of the diverse evidence? I think what we can see here is that there was reinforcement of Ionian settlers when the Massaliotes were at war with the Segobrigians, described in detail by Justin, and when they needed more manpower, and when then around 500 they expanded their colonies along the Gaulish and Eastern Iberian coast, and Ephesus, interestingly, is the leader. No longer Phocaea, which didn't play any role anymore, no longer Miletus, and that takes us to the time when Miletus was destroyed after the Ionian revolt, when then very briefly Ephesus played the leading role before the Athenians took over. We then see that there was an influx of people and cults, but it's only throughout the centuries that then different social groups, together with their cults, became dominant. I think we can then see that gradually the story of Aristoxene was superseded by the story of Aristarche, where then the Ephesians were claiming leadership role in the foundation of Massalia in the first place. So I could here quickly summarize what I have. Will I have another 3-5 minutes?
Oh, yeah, that's okay.
That's okay. Then I can summarize here. So Phocaea founded around 600 when there were conflicts between Segobrigians and Ligurians, and they were welcomed in as allies of the local king Nannos. And perhaps there was in the mid-6th century a recollection of a certain Simos, possibly even of a certain Gyptis, possibly even of her father's names Nannos. I cannot exclude that these names might have been historical. What we then see is that around 545, when more Phocaeans wanted to land and settle, they were rejected from the coast, as we learn from Antiochus of Sicily, and that seems to represent a situation in which not the Phocaeans were in the lead in Massalia, but still the Segobrigians. But that changed by the end of the century, when we see conflicts between the ethnics and an intake of more settlers from Asia Minor. Gradually, after there had been some instability, we see Protiadic leadership established, and the coin evidence shows that this was from around 475 until, and it's very difficult to say when, it's a gradual transition in the next century, but within a century then, first Apollo took over the lead as the main cult deity, and then Artemis in the next century. Now, when Aristotle was writing, he was already in one of these later phases, but he drew on texts that were older and reflected a time when the Protiadai were still in the lead. And then we have the Strabo writing in the time of Augustus, and he draws on the later traditions when Artemis was in the lead, when the Ephesians were in the lead, and when Aristoxene had been superseded by Aristarchos. And what is it that Pompeius Trogus and Justin later may add? It's a very strong Roman layer, and sometimes obscure mixes of the different layers that do not necessarily make sense to them anymore. But something that does make sense for them is the change of mixed wine, well-mixed wine, to water. So in Justin's narrative, Gyptis offers water to the newcomer because they were not yet civilized, they did not yet know about it. Okay, a few more minutes and outlook. I take up the same illustration, which I try to interpret in its 18th century meaning, but it has been resumed recently in Michael Dietler's book, which is very post-colonial, and which tries to rewrite the history of viticulture in Gaul through, end of Massalia as well, by emphasizing the agency of the Gauls. They were not just colonized, but they made active choices. They found out that viticulture would be beneficial for them. And that is why this illustration, of course, fits in so very well. It's an active choice. That is a new perspective that post-colonial cultures certainly have brought into classical study. Now, through the 19th century and 20th century, we find many romanticizing illustrations, an opera, a concert here as an example, and some 20th century illustrations, which I have not even been able to identify, and I have to do some more research, but this gives you an idea of how popular and widespread the tradition is. I want to end by focusing on the latest tradition or retelling, latest version of the story by Alain Ballatier, a publicist, an activist from Marseille. He had a neighborhood, a community action which focused on the story of Gyptis. La légende du mariage de Gyptis et Protiadai revisité. So you'll find online also a short film, a film project. And how does he describe the encounter? Lors de ses noces, la princesse choisit alors d'épouser l'étranger en lui présentant une coupe emplie d'eau. Dans le film, ce sera du vin rouge naturel issu de l'agriculture biologique au cours d'un repas. So here, water is taken with a completely new symbolic meaning as purity, but also being progressive even, progressive and refined. So that's a nice reinterpretation. Another reinterpretation. Il est pour le moins étonnant de voir, 500 ans avant notre ère, la fille d'un roi décider librement de qui sera son mari, remettant en cause la notion de mariage arrangé et la domination masculine a priori. So in some progressive circles, it's very popular to identify examples in antiquity where there was no patriarchy. So the situation here is limited. There is no father who tells her to pick. We do not hear that she's actually not part of the party, but she's only called in late in the party to choose. No, this is here represented as a very or Gyptis is represented as a very self-confident woman. This is one scene of the film, which is on Vimeo. And you immediately see actually two other adaptations to a modern audience. So the newcomer to a place in France is now an Algerian. The lady who is supposed to marry him is no longer a girl. The marital age was close to 14, 15 years. Then in antiquity and throughout the Middle Ages. But nowadays in modern France, it's more typically in the 30s. So you have a white woman representing modern day France, and she is now on her search for a marital partner. And this is now, the example is chosen as inviting intermarriage. So there is a conclusion by Balatier. La légende du mariage gréco-ligure revisitée au XXe siècle est une ode au métissage, an ode to métissage, à la France du partage. C'est un pied de nez aux racistes de tous bords, un espoir pour une société qui veut aller de l'avant et qui a le goût de l'autre. So very inclusive, and I'm coming to an end now. I don't want to pick on this retelling by saying, oh, that's historically inaccurate, and that is a wrong assumption about antiquity. No, this is an illustration of an adaptation of an old story in a changed ideological context, and moreover, it's aiming for redrawing ethnic boundaries. That's important, and it may also be an encouragement for us to give new life to old stories, and we'll have a little bit more about the power of storytelling tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was a very interesting paper, very convincing, a very interesting approach to this old myth, and also a very interesting outlook at to our time. So I think there will be many questions for that. So who would like to ask something or to discuss something? Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for this very interesting presentation. I just have one question to the coin on the coin because I like coins. Are we sure, or is scholarship sure that this is a wheel represented on this coin? Because maybe I thought it might also be like maybe a shield, something like it's very different from a Boeotian shield, of course, or other depictions. But do we have other symbols of Celtic origin that we have on Massalian coins? For example, I would think about a horse or epona or these typical motifs.
So that is a good question, and I have to say my own research is somewhat limited. But in all the catalogs, the online catalogs that I looked, it was classified as a four-spoked wheel. And it looks quite similar also to four-spoked wheels that we would have on archaic coins of Athens. For example, we have one in our own pipe coin collection, Wendy, isn't it? But I am not sure if in that early period we have representations of shields in that shape. I cannot, if you have arguments to speak against it, I would be very glad to follow up on them. But I have not found any controversy about this, so it's not my interpretation. I just follow what I found in the catalogs. But I have to admit, I have to do some more research. Again, that's also a more recent part where I try to go beyond my literary sources and see how we can move forward.
I think we have another question online from Martha.
Marta?
Yes, here I am. Thank you, Altay, for this very interesting presentation. I have a question, or rather a suggestion for you, regarding the version in which we have two oikistai, Simos and Protis. I think I have already told you in July that here you have, I think, a line to study. It's very interesting to find two oikistai instead of one in one version and not in the other. I think, if I'm not wrong, that Pompeius Trogus has two oikistai, Simos and Protis, and Aristotle has just one. So when you have two oikistai, it is quite possible to find some love story behind this situation, just like we have seen before in Lampsacus. There was Phobos and Blepsus. Phobos didn't want to go to the colony, and he sent his twin brother, Blepsus, and afterwards he jumped from the Leucadian rock. So maybe there is some love story completely lost, unfortunately. But I think that this two oikistai points to an earlier legend, as you suggest. I think you suggest that Pompeius Trogus has probably some more ancient questions than Aristotle. So maybe you have made some researches about this, or you have some ideas about this.
Thank you, Marta. I do have some ideas, even though they do not go into the direction of love. Although it's so the example from Lampsacus that you gave is a good example of duplication, and I think there may be many different reasons. We can also think of Romulus and Remus. And they, I think they stand in a tradition of duplication of founders. One possibly obvious reason might be that there may have been different leaders at different times. So maybe that one of the two was the leader of the Phocaeans and another was the leader of the Ephesians. So I thought about this possibility, but then I rejected it. Because Protis, clearly, as we know the tradition of Aristotle, he cannot have been the original founder. He only, in the version of Aristotle, he was the son, actually the grandson of Nannos and the son of Euxenos. And when he then moves up in the genealogy, that seems to me to indicate that this is a younger tradition, and induced by the ethnic and genealogical reinterpretation. He could no longer be the son of the princess. So, but as he was so closely connected with the origin stories, he could not be excluded from the story. So he had to take his role. And then I think Simos, as his name is not motivated in any way, and as Euxenos no longer shows up in that narrative, I think the most likely is that Simos was somewhere attested as the leader of the Phocaeans in the oldest narratives, and that the change then is quite late. So that's how I would explain this without denying that your interpretation of a possible love story similar to that of Lampsakos should be considered as a possibility. But here, given my specific genealogical interpretation of Protis, and then connecting it with the Athenian turn, which had to reinterpret him as someone of pure Greek blood, that would be my preference for the current story. Of course, I have to admit there is always a lot of speculation as long as we are depending on so many fragments. We can just try to put the pieces together in the most plausible way by comparing with other traditions. So that would be my response, Marta.
Thank you very much, Altay. Very convincing.
So we have two more questions. First Naomi and then Eva.
Hi, can you hear me?
Hi, Naomi. Yes, good to see you.
Hello, wonderful. Thank you so much, Altay, for the talk. I just wanted to kind of go back to your discussion where you mentioned that there was a bit of a shift from kind of collaboration between the Greeks and Gauls, and then as around the date of 540 BCE comes about, there seems to be a shift. They reject the kind of new influx of settlers from Ionia. And I wanted to kind of bring into the narrative the presence of kind of rivals in the region, the Etruscans. It is exactly at 540 where we have the Battle of Alalea between the Phocaeans and the people of Caira with the help of the Carthaginians. And so when we're talking about like kind of the constitution of identities in the face of the other, with Hall's argument, it's like this is a moment where we're seeing a whole bunch of competing people active in Gaul, trying to monopolize trade in Gaul, and like how that could have catalyzed this shift in kind of attitudes between both the Gauls and the surrounding neighbors in the region and the Greeks themselves.
So that's a good question. And you know what, on the long run, to answer that historical questions, I will have to draw on friends who are experts in this area, which is you, Naomi. The thing is, what I have done is I concentrated on the literary traditions, and I tried to explain the literary tradition as we have it. But then I have to concede to you, strangely, the Etruscans and the Carthaginians, who did play a very important role in the 6th century in precisely that area, are completely excluded from the literary tradition that we have, at least the tradition of Massalia. So there is a little bit on them in Herodotus and Thucydides, who have different perspectives. So it is quite surprising that they are excluded, but I would say the reason for that is they did not play any role in the intended ethnic identity description that the narratives were meant to develop, to design. And then at later stages, they were even forgotten or not considered relevant anymore. So even a deeper level of insignificance in the Greco-Roman tradition. But when we try to when we want to address what was going on historically at the time, we really need to bring the Etruscan and the Carthaginians into the picture. And then I'm glad I can count on your support for that. So that's how I would respond. It's not entirely satisfactory for you because it means more work for you in the future, but that's the price. Does anyone else have an idea that might satisfy Naomi's question? As we are a workshop, we are all in this together. No, then we leave it at that for now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then our last question.
Thank you so much, Altay. That was very interesting. I'm not sure if there are questions or observations. If you go back to the coin that Philip pointed out before, I don't know if anyone has picked up the fact, not this coin, the one before. That's it.
This one, and then there is the other one.
Yes, voila, that one. That's the one I was looking for. To me, in comparison to the coins that you've shown later, this one seems decidedly Gaulish because the hairstyle is so very different
to the curly Greek that you see immediately after with Apollo and Artemis.
Yes.
I mean, the more I look at it, the more this is not Greek. The representation of a Greek. So I don't know what you can do with this information. And then I kept listening to you talking about Simos. But every time you have expeditions, colonial expeditions from Greece that visit the Oracle of Delphi, especially in the case of Cyrene, for example, the colonizers tend to have a physical difficulty, physical problem. Either they are stutterers or they can't walk properly. And I was thinking, if you change the accent of Simos to Simos, it means snub-nosed, ugly, which would explain why the guy in the early tradition is called Euxenos, beautiful foreigner, not good foreigner, handsome foreigner. Only he's not all that handsome after all.
So you mean it would be a euphemism?
Yes. Yes.
So thank you for all your hints. I think your hint to the hairstyle is immediately helpful and very supportive. Yeah. The other needs some more thinking, but can also, in fact, support my relative chronology. Understanding Euxenos as specifically responding to Simos. What I am not so sure about, would you say that this is then purely at a literary level, and you would not see any potential connection to a physical leader at the time, which I was potentially willing to grant? I'm not claiming it, but as I did not see any motivation of the name, and as I identified it as a very old layer, potentially going back to the 6th century.
I think it would agree with all the other colonizing narratives that you have from the 6th century. To have someone with a physical disability is perfectly fine, because that's what all the other traditions claim. I cannot really tell you whether the guy who founded Cyrene was indeed a stutterer, but that's how he's described. Mm-hmm. This is always an etiology as to why these people have to live. Often, instead of a physical difficulty, they tend to have committed murders. Mm-hmm. So they need to go into exile. So there is always some trouble brewing at home, whether they are not accepted because they're not perfect physically, or they have committed something that has angered the community, therefore they need to be expelled. Mm-hmm. So that fits perfectly with that, and it does not disrupt the possibility that there may be some historical truth behind it.
Okay, thank you very much. That was all very helpful, and will find its way into my manuscript. Well, thank you, Eva.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much again for the presentation and the fruitful discussion. Yeah, thank you.